Chapter 1 of The Golden Bough. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Oliva. The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. To Dr. John Bach McMaster. Your muse, aweary with the stress of putting facts in careful dress, has doffed her dignity and made of history a masquerade. She prays you, sir, to follow me into the realm of fantasy, where Clio, in a cap and bells, with blither mien, our story tells. Crepuscule. In the still evening air, the dust hung golden for a moment and then slowly settled on tree and hedgerow. From a distance, faintly diminishing, the tinkle of sheep bells, the call of a bird, the sighing of a breeze, and then silence. Against the stillness, suddenly, as though pricked upon the velvety background of the summer night, a quick, sharp staccato note near at hand, a crackle as of brittle things breaking, and a large thorn bush by the side of the deserted road quivered and shook as its leaves parted, and a head appeared. It was an eager, boyish head, but almost unpleasantly alert, its brows furrowing, its dark eyes peering to right and left with a swift furtiveness that held little of assurance. A moment of quick inspection, and a pair of broad shoulders emerged, followed by a body and long legs which strode into the middle of the road, where the man paused a moment, looking at the afterglow in the west, and then set off with long steps to the south. He wore what had once been a uniform of the Legionnaire, but rough contacts and hard usage had eliminated all distinguishing marks, and a coating of dust and stain had further disguised him. It seemed as though nature, conspiring as it does against the enemies of its wild people, had given this man its protective coloring, that he might elude those who sought him. To carry the analogy further, he was shaggy, unkempt, dusty and lean, like a brown bear sniffing the breeze after a long period of hibernation. The stride was rapid, but it was cautious, too, and once at a fancied shadow in the road ahead of him, the soldier darted into the bushes and crouched, listening. Fear had made him cautious, but his necessity knew no law, so he rose at last, went onward more rapidly into the gathering dusk, aware that the end of his pilgrimage was near at hand, there, just beyond the hills before him, in the free republic of the Swiss. As he neared the lights of the village, his pace grew slower, and, leaving the road, he turned into a meadow to his right, in the direction of a grove of trees, which seemed to promise a temporary refuge while he planned a raid upon some nearby larder or hen roost. But contrary to his expectations, when he reached the shadows of the trees, he found his way impeded by a high stone wall which thrust suddenly upon him out of the darkness. A wall! A monastery? Or a barracks, perhaps, full of the hated gray uniforms guarding the frontier. He paused a moment, deliberating, but conscious of more than a mild curiosity as to the purpose of this walled enclosure. High up on this mountainside, which seemed so peaceful and so free from the horrors he had left back there in the levels below. Only yesterday, down the valley, he had seen them, the gray uniforms, and here too, at any moment. He grinned at the wall. He was weary of flight. A wall! A garden within, a monastery most likely, sanctuary. At any rate, he could go no further without food. This place would do as well as another. If there were monks within, there would also be a kitchen. And with such a wall, a larder, unguarded. Moving to the right, he found a tree, the lower branches of which extended over the coping of the wall. At the foot of the tree he paused again, looking upward curiously, for upon the leaves of the tree he saw the reflection of yellow lights which seemed to be moving within the enclosure. Climbing noiselessly, he drew himself to the level of the coping of the wall and peered over. Through the foliage of his tree he could distinguish nothing clearly, but he was aware of a lantern and a figure which moved slowly in an open space just beyond the thicket below him. It seemed that the figure wore a hood upon its head and a gown. A monastery, of course, and this a monk. The gardener, perhaps, upon a lonely vigil of penance and meditation. In any event, the fugitive was now in no immediate danger from his pursuers, so he crawled out along a heavy branch of the tree which extended over the garden and noiselessly lowered himself to the top of the wall. Here he hung in a moment of indecision, preparing an avenue of escape should his venture prove hazardous. And then peering again toward the dark habit of the holy man, now in silhouette against the light, he lowered himself by his hands and dropped to the ground. Danger had made him skillful, but he was aware of the thud of his heavy boots in the soft loam and crouched cautiously behind the thicket, ready for the slightest movement of alarm in the figure by the lantern. After a moment, in which he reassured himself that the sound of his fall had not awakened the watcher from his reverie, he crawled forward until he reached the furthermost bush, where he paused again, still in hiding, and peered across the small stretch of lawn toward the light. There was a raised dais or platform of earth, approached from two sides by steps of stone. There were two stone benches above, and upon one of them, leaning forward toward a small oak tree in the center of the guarded space, sat the dark figure which had carried the lantern. The eyes of the légionnaire, now grown accustomed to the glow of the light, made sure that the figure had not moved, nor was aware of his silent and furtive approach. Two plans of action suggested themselves. One, to move behind the foliage to the right and intercept the monk with the lantern should he attempt to flee toward the lights of the house nearby. The other, to risk all in a frank statement, a plea for charity and asylum. But as the figure remained as before, staring past the lantern at the solitary oak tree, as though lost in contemplation of its branches, the légionnaire rose, silently crossed the lawn, and reached the stone steps, where the crackle of a twig beneath his foot, with a sudden and startling clearness, revealed his presence. He was aware of the dark figure above him springing to its feet and turning with a swift, graceful motion which swept the dark cowl from its curly head and betrayed the identity of its owner, a girl, quite lovely in her fear of this tattered brown ghost that had come upon her vigils. In an awed whisper she spoke a few words in a language he did not understand, and then was silent, watching him, frightened. "Bitte, Fräulein," he began softly. The sound of his voice reassured her. She turned toward him and seemed to search his figure more intently, and then in French, peremptorily, "What do you want? Who are you?" she said. At the sound of the French tongue, spoken rapidly and without a trace of accent, the brown ghost smiled eagerly. "Ah, mademoiselle is French. Then I am sure of her charity and forgiveness." He had put one foot upon the lowest step of the dais when she took a pace toward him and extended her cloaked arms as though barring the way, repeating her former questions. "What are you doing here? And what do you want?" "I am hungry, mademoiselle, also thirsty, for I have come far." Her glance swept his figure and then, as though identifying him, returned with more assurance to his face. "You're a soldier, a Frenchman?" "A soldier." He hesitated, looking down at his tattered sleeve, and then more deliberately as his gaze sought her face. "Mademoiselle is not a German. No German speaks French as you do." "And what?" "Merely that I am an escaped prisoner of Germany, on my way to Switzerland." He smiled. "You see, I am frank with you. Something tells me that you're friendly." "Switzerland!" she said. "Did you not know that you were already 15 kilometers within the Swiss border?" "Switzerland here?" The mingled expression of bewilderment and surprise upon his dirty face was comical. "Switzerland!" he gasped again. "You must have passed the frontier in the night," added the girl. "You're quite safe now, I should say." "Sacred name of a pipe!" He grinned, and then with an air of apology. "Pardon, mademoiselle. If I'd known that I'd passed the border, I shouldn't have intruded. But I was hungry, thirsty, too, and I thought that I might find meat, drink, a place to sleep in peace." He paused, waiting for the girl to speak, but she said nothing and only stood frowning toward the lights at the other side of the garden. "Of course, mademoiselle, since I'm now safe from pursuit, if you wish it, I can retire by the way I came." He shrugged and turned half away when the sound of her voice halted him. I do not wish to be inhospitable," she said softly. "It is your right to ask asylum of us. But you have come, monsieur, upon cloistered soil." "A convent?" "No, not a convent," she said, "but private land, dedicated to solitude and she paused uncertainly. "You would not understand." He waited for her to go on, but she stopped abruptly and said no more. The strangeness of her garb, the mingled frankness and reticence of her speech, which excited friendly curiosity while it repelled inquiry, gave the fugitive a new interest in the cowled figure, an interest in which even the pangs of hunger and weariness were forgotten. From the top step she towered above him, her dark robe hanging with a majestic stateliness which somehow belied the testimony of the curly, reddish brown hair and the red lips which had already been perilously near a roguish smile. Something in the eager expression of the face of her guest as he looked at her made her suddenly aware of the exigencies of the occasion, for she drew the cowl about her head and came down the steps, leaving the lantern upon the stone bench beside the small tree. "Wait here," she said quietly, "at the foot of the steps. If you will promise me not to——" She turned and looked toward the mound. "If you will remain here without moving, I'll see what can be done." "I will promise anything, mademoiselle." They looked into each other's eyes a moment, smiling in a friendly way, and then she passed him and vanished within the house. The soldier took off his cap and rubbed his head thoughtfully. Cloistered soil. The phrase hung in his ears. A queer place this, a queer creature, this girl. To his Western eyes she seemed better suited to a tennis match or a game of golf than to this mooning by lamplight with shadows in eyes which were only meant for joy and laughter. What was her nationality? Not French, though she spoke it like a native. Not Swiss, and surely not German. Something more easternly, oriental almost. She was a paradox, a lovely paradox indeed to eyes long starved of beauty and gentleness. But other considerations were less important to the fugitive than the gnawing ache of his hunger and the demands of a body already taxed for many weeks to its utmost. Obeying the injunction of the girl not to move, he sank to the stone step. When she returned, she found him with his head bent forward upon his knees, already dozing. But at the light touch upon his shoulders he sprang to his feet, his club raised upon the defensive, almost oversetting the dish which carried his supper. "Be careful," said the girl. He stared at her in a moment of incomprehension, but the sight of the bread, meat and cheese quickly restored him to sanity. I beg pardon," he began. "I dreamed." But his hands were already reaching forward toward the dish, and with a smile she handed it to him. "Sit again. Eat and drink. There is milk." He obeyed, wasting no words, and she sat beside him, watching calmly while he bolted the food like a famished wolf. He finished what was on the platter and all of the milk before he spoke again. Then he wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and gave a great grunt of satisfaction. "Shall I bring you more?" she asked. "No, no thanks. You're very good, mademoiselle. I didn't know I was so hungry." "Are you sure you've had enough?" "Oh, yes." "When was the last time you ate?" "The day before yesterday. I didn't dare to leave the woods, even at night." "You've traveled far?" "A million miles, I think. I don't know how far. They had me working on the railroad near Mannheim." "And you escaped?" "At night, from the pen. They shot at me, but I swam down a stream and got away. I lived on berries for a while, and potatoes, when I could steal them. I'm a living example of food conservation. It was risky work approaching the farmhouses, on account of the dogs. Some of us may think Germany will go to the dogs. But I'm sure of one thing, and that is that all the dogs in the world have gone to Germany, and they never sleep. I went miles out of my way to avoid the roads. You're the first human being I've spoken to for weeks. It's quite extraordinary to be able to talk again, to have someone listen. Sometimes in the deep woods I used to talk to myself, just to hear the sound of my own voice." "I'm very sorry for you." There was no doubting the sincerity of her tone or the gentleness in her eyes. "Sorry, are you? That's very wonderful. I thought that people had stopped being sorry for anything in this world." "It's terrible to be so bitter." He laughed. "I'm not bitter. I never felt more amiable in my life. But the world has gone mad, mademoiselle." "The Germans treated you badly?" He smiled and shrugged. "What would you have? It is war." "It is terrible. And what will you do now that you are across the border? Will they not intern you?" "I must find civilian clothing." "And then?" He laughed joyously. "I will cross into France at the Swiss border and rejoin my regiment. Parbleu! There are some there who will think I have risen from the dead." She was silent for a moment, regarding him thoughtfully, her eyes brightening with a new interest. At first he had seemed a man of middle age, a broken man, such as passed begging along the roads of the village. And the dirt and the ragged beard that covered his face had done nothing to dispel the illusion. But she saw now how far she had been mistaken, for his laughter rippled forth from his lean muscular throat as though in pure joy at its own utterance. He was not bitter. He was merely experienced. "You're a Frenchman, monsieur?" "No, mademoiselle. An American." "American!" And you fought long for France?" "More than 2 years." "You were living in France?" "No, mademoiselle, in America. But I could not stand what happened in Belgium, and so I came. It's very simple." "But you speak French?" "German and Italian. I've been much in Europe. I had a gift for languages. But I'm not of much account otherwise. I'm a ne'er-do-well, a black sheep." He grinned at her. "I do look rather black now, don't I? You'd be surprised to see how much better I look when I'm clean." "I don't doubt it, monsieur." Youth called to youth. Her laugh echoed softly among the venerable trees, and as she raised her chin, the cowl slipped from her head again, disclosing her curly hair, a copper-colored nimbus against the glow of the lantern. He turned a little toward her and glanced at her with more assurance, and then with a smile. "You're just a girl, aren't you?" She laughed again. "What did you think I was?" "I didn't know," he said more slowly. "You seemed something between a shade and a mother superior." "A very inferior mother superior, monsieur." She smiled, and then with more soberness, "I don't wonder you were perplexed. Sometimes I am a little perplexed myself." She halted and did not resume, and so, "I should not be inquisitive," he said. "Your hospitality gives me no further claim." "What is it that you wish to know?" "Who and what you are. Is it not natural that I should like to know to whom I am indebted?" "It doesn't matter. What I have done is little enough beside what you have suffered for poor bleeding France. At least we are allies." "You?" "A Russian." "Ah." "A modern Russian, monsieur. A free spirit of the times in which we live. It is the aim of my life to do for my own country what you have done for France." "But to fight, mademoiselle?" "With subtler weapons than yours. It is to that I dedicate my life." She rose suddenly, as though realizing that she had already said too much. She picked up the dish and bowl and took an irresolute step away from him. "I would like to ask you to stay, but——" She paused and whispered quickly, "He comes. Say nothing. Let me tell your story. Perhaps you may remain to sleep here." And, following her glance, he saw a figure emerging from the gloom in the direction of the house, the tall figure of a man with shoulders bent and eager eyes which, like those of a black nocturnal cat, had already caught a pale reflection of the lantern's gleams. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Enigma. As the man came nearer, he seemed a remarkable creature. His coat, of the kind known in the '80s as a Prince Albert, hung loosely from his lean, square shoulders to a point midway between hip and knee. His hair was dark and long, and wisps of it had fallen over his broad, pale forehead, to which they adhered, as though a tight hat band had pressed them there. Heavy eyebrows met above a long, narrow nose, which jutted down over lips turned in, thin and impalpable, to the square chin which was thrust out aggressively as he strode forward, his hands working unpleasantly at the ends of his long wrists. "What's this, Tanya Korasov?" he asked in a sharp, querulous voice. "A hungry soldier, Kirillo Ivanich," said the girl. Her shining eyes glanced quickly toward the dais. "He came over the wall. He was much in need of rest and food." "Ah," growled the other. "A soldier." "He goes to join his colors." The frown on the brows of the man in the Prince Albert relaxed, and he seemed to give a gasp of relief as he examined the intruder more calmly.
"The world has gone rabid with the smell of blood, even here, all about us."
He broke off suddenly, turning to the girl.
"You have fed him?"
"Yes, Cirillo, but I doubted—"
"We are not savages, monsieur," he broke in. "You shall be made comfortable for the night. Come, Tanya, the lantern." And he led the way across the lawn to the house, while Tanya mounted the dais for the lantern and followed them. Whatever the doubts of the girl as to the hospitality which might be accorded him, the fugitive now saw no reason to suspect the intentions of the strange gentleman in the Prince Albert coat, for as they reached the building he stood aside, indicating the lighted doorway. "Enter, mon ami," he said. "It shall not be said that this house refuses charity or alms to any seeker after liberty, even though he go about his quest in a manner with which we disapprove."
"Thanks, monsieur," said the soldier gratefully. The room which they entered was the kitchen, and the two persons who occupied it, an aged woman and a youngish man with a shock of yellow hair, paused in the act of masticating, remaining with their full mouths open and eyes staring until the young soldier had passed through the door into the main building beyond. In the brief moment of passing them, the American experienced the same sense of vague hostility as that which had first greeted him in the man Ivanich. A querulous attitude of anxious suspicion which for some unknown reason had now disappeared. A look of expectancy in their eyes, or was it a veiled fear, as of some danger which might come upon them unawares? Was this the reason for the wall? And if so, why a girl in a monk's cowl for sentry? He was too weary to analyze the return of his impressions, and when the Russian reached the room beyond the kitchen, he motioned the légionnaire to a chair while he bade the girl Tanya bring forth glasses and a jug.
"Sit a moment, monsieur the soldier," he said suavely. "It is Chartreuse, the real Chartreuse, made years ago by the monks not many leagues from here. There is little of it left even in Switzerland. It will give you new life."
The soldier pledged his host and hostess and drank. "You are very good," he said with real gratitude. "I came to steal and go upon my way," he smiled. "And so your kindness and that of mademoiselle covers me with confusion."
"Ah, necessity knows no law," said the Russian pleasantly. "You shall have a bed, a night of sleep, and your necessity shall be our pleasure."
"But my intrusion! If one lives within a wall, it is doubtless to keep people out. But in helping me, monsieur, you are helping France. And in helping France, Russia."
"Russia!"
There was a finality of despair in the tone with which Cirillo Ivanich uttered the word.
"May God grant her help, for she needs it. We pray for her as we work for her in secret, in secret."
Ivanich clasped his bony fingers and squeezed them until the knuckles cracked.
"If it will give you courage to fight with steel and bullets, I will tell you that great things are in the air for Russia and for all the world."
"Freedom," said the American. "I know. It is written. So much blood cannot be shed in vain."
"We labor for the same end, you and I,"
went on the Russian.
"The same end, but with different means."
And then with a look of quick inspection,
You join the Legion soon again?" The gaze of the Russian quickened as for the first time he noted the soldier's uniform. "What is your name, monsieur?" "Phil Roland." "Roland." He puzzled over the pronunciation slowly. "Roland. I am an American." "Ah, American." "My mother was Italian." "But American. How happens it that you are here in this uniform?" "I'm a citizen of the world, a nomad. I like adventure, and so when the war broke out I sailed and joined the Foreign Legion." "The Legion? A regiment of young devils. It is madness, a mad cause. To what end?" "That France may live." "Ah, yes." And then suddenly, "You'll join the Legion soon again." The American would have replied, but the girl Tanya, who had stood behind his chair, broke in quickly. "Monsieur Roland is tired, Kirylo Ivanitch. Is it not better that I show him to his room? Tomorrow he will tell you." "Your chartreuse has already restored me, mademoiselle." The Russian waved his hand and Tanya Korasov sank into a chair. "An American! I have always wanted to go to America. One day you will learn to think over there, and then you will be able to help with the great problems of Europe. Your mother was Italian?" he asked. Phil Roland smiled good-naturedly at the persistence of his questioner. "Yes, monsieur, of an ancient and noble family. But in America we make little of ancestry." "Yet it is important." The deep gaze of the Russian, which had been fixed upon the jug upon the table, turned slowly and fastened upon the uniform of the Legionnaire, the shocking condition of which had not been visible in the dim light of the garden. "You have fared badly, Monsieur Roland. Your uniform shows hard usage." "What would you? I was captured in it and have worn it ever since. The Boches do not trouble to send their prisoners to a tailor." "The Boches? You were then a prisoner of the Germans?" The Russian straightened in his chair, his bony hands clasping its arms, his brows tangling suddenly. "Until 3 weeks ago, yes, monsieur." It was not imagination that gave Phil Roland the notion that the tone of voice of the Russian had suddenly changed again. He felt the black eyes, now almost hidden under the dark bushy brows, burning into his own. And while he could not explain the feeling of inquietude, he realized that some chance remark of his had aroused a dormant devil in his host. "A prisoner! The Germans!" he repeated quickly. "And you came here to Nemi. Who sent you hither?" "Why, no one, monsieur," said the American easily, with a smile which concealed his growing curiosity. "I do not even know just when or where I crossed the border." "Ah, it is strange that you should come here. Italian, too." Ivanitch wagged his great head quickly. The girl Tanya broke in with a short laugh. "Monsieur Roland is not the first escaping soldier who has passed through the village. You remember last week." "But he went away, Tanya Korasov. He did not stay," broke in Ivanitch excitedly. The American rose from his chair, mystified. "As I shall do now, monsieur, if you will permit me." He took a pace toward a door which seemed to lead toward the front of the house. But the girl stood before him and faced her compatriot, who had sunk again in his chair, his head deep in his shoulders. "For shame, Kirylo Ivanitch," she said in a spirited voice. "For shame that you should be so inhospitable. The man is dead upon his feet, and you send him out into the night, to be interned perhaps tomorrow." "An escaping prisoner! A slave!" He rose from his chair, brushing his hair back with a wild gesture. "You were a slave, were you not? A slave to the Germans? Answer me."
Had the man suddenly gone mad? Or was the brain of the Legionnaire suffering from a delusion of its own weariness? What was the meaning of this extraordinary conversation? What the significance of this sudden and strange hostility? And what difference could it make to this man Ivanich whether he, Roland, had been a slave or not? The American shrugged and smiled again, more patiently. "A slave?" he replied. "One might call it that. I worked like a dog upon the railroad. I was chained to the man next me, and would have been shot had I attempted resistance." The result of this innocent explanation was still more surprising. "There!" cried the Russian wildly, exhorting the girl. "Did I not tell you so? A slave, an escaping slave here at Nemi. Let him go, I say, or I shall not answer for the consequences." "Of course, monsieur," said Roland. But at a sign from the girl, the American paused at the door and stood, his weariness forgotten in the curious dialogue that followed, which seemed to plunge him deeper into the mystery of this strange couple and the house of the walled garden. The girl Tanya crossed the room swiftly and noiselessly, and laid her hand upon the arm of Kirylo Ivanich, who now paced to and fro before the fireplace like some caged beast, his head lowered, seeming not to see but furtively watching the dusty boots of the astonished fugitive. "It is not possible, Kirylo," she said softly. "He knows nothing. Would he not have broken it at once? Who was to have prevented him? Not I. He is merely a boy and free from guile. Can you not see?" "It is dangerous for him to remain," gasped the Russian. "It is more dangerous for you to indulge these mad fancies. It is safe yonder. Go and see for yourself. I, Tanya Korasov, will vouch for this weary fugitive. But you shall not turn a loyal ally of Russia out into the night. Tomorrow he shall go forth, and you shall send him, refreshed and safely conducted to the border of France, when he will go and fight your battles and mine with the common enemy of humanity. Do you hear?" He stared at her sullenly. "I shall conduct him nowhere. I wish him to go," he said. But the girl stood her ground, continuing calmly. "Tomorrow morning you shall give him a suit of civilian clothing, and he will go upon his way, thanking you, Kirylo Ivanich. That is all." "A boy? Yes, no doubt. But destiny is too strong. Italian! What if—" He paused, running his bony fingers through his long hair. "Impossible. It cannot be," she soothed him. "I have much to do. Tomorrow or next day they are coming. The conference is momentous. If anything should—" "Shh! He shall be gone." The girl turned to the American as though to atone for the strange conduct of her compatriot, and smiled graciously. "You will forgive the whim of Monsieur Ivanich, I am sure. He works too hard all day and most of the night. You would understand if you knew his problems, his suspicions, his labors." "I'm still willing to go, mademoiselle, if monsieur still desires it," said Roland easily. For a moment they had been lost in each other. A gasp from the direction of the fireplace, and as they turned, Kirylo Ivanich fled past them silently and out into the darkness of the night. The look the American sent after him gave the girl a true vision of what was passing in his mind. "You think that he is mad," she said soberly. "It is not so. An obsession——" She paused abruptly, as though the words had been stifled upon her lips, and shrugged lightly. "I can tell you nothing. But on this I am resolved. You shall not be sent forth tonight, or taken tomorrow when France, my country's ally, needs you yonder." He caught her hand and pressed it to his lips, and then, with a joyous smile,
I shall fight the better for the memory of this hour. Whatever your mission here, mademoiselle, God grant you success in it. And for the part of one soul which passes yours like a ship in the night, I pray that we may meet again." "It shall be so, perhaps," she said easily, though she flushed at the warmth of his words. "When a razor and a bath shall have made me once more a gentleman," he added with a laugh. "Perhaps that may be tomorrow," she returned gaily. The roguish smile that had died stillborn upon her lips there earlier in the garden came suddenly upon the sweetness of her lips and gave them new lines of loveliness which made him glad that she had saved it for the light where he might see. She noted the look of admiration in his dark eyes and turned quickly away, taking up a candle from the table. "Until tomorrow, then, monsieur," she said decisively. "For now you shall go to bed." "I am no longer tired." But she was already moving toward the stairway to the upper floors. "If you will follow me," she said calmly, and led the way up the stairs, her soft black robe caressing her slender ankles. A lamp, set in a bracket, burned dimly upon the second floor, and he followed her heavily down the high, echoing corridor. A large hall, scantily furnished, dim and mysterious, with many doors to right and left. A house, it seemed, more like a hotel than a villa, and more like a monastery than either. The girl led the way and opened at last a door near the end of the corridor, entering the room and setting the candle upon a table. In the flickering light which cast its shadows upward along her face, she seemed to have taken again the character of the priestess, the shade of the garden, with the cowl and robe of mystery. Her expression, too, seemed to have grown more serious, though the golden nimbus of light was again entwined about her ruddy hair. "Good night, Monsieur Roland," she said gently. "Tomorrow morning you will find a change of clothing upon the chair outside the door. Sleep safely. If you fear——" She paused. "Fear?" he asked. "Of what?" "I forgot that you are a soldier. But when I go out, nevertheless, you shall bolt this door upon the inside." And as he turned to her in inquiry, "No, you must ask no questions, but only obey." His smile met with no response, and so he shrugged and bowed. "It shall be as you desire, mademoiselle." And without a word she was gone. He listened for a moment to the light tap of her footfalls down the corridor until he heard them no more, when he closed the heavy door, bolted it, and sank upon the small iron bed while he tried to ponder a solution of the events of the evening. Out of the train of vague occurrences stood clearly the wholesome, friendly figure of this girl, Tanya Korasoff. Her robes, her cowl, the vestments of her strange association with the fanatic Kirilo Ivanich seemed only to bring her sanity, youth, and kindliness into stronger relief. That she was a member of some secret association of which her compatriot was the head seemed more or less obvious. But what was the personal relationship between them? The man had intellectual power and doubtless held his sway as the official director of some sort of propaganda for the freedom of Russia, but his deference to the wishes of the girl made it also evident that she too was high in his counsels. His niece? His cousin? Or was their relation something nearer, something impossible? The man was 50, the girl young enough to be his daughter. A relationship purely intellectual, more deeply welded by the bonds of a cognate purpose. But what of the robes? The vigils, the dais in the garden,
the strange dialogue about the escaping slave, which seemed to have so large a part in determining his own status as a guest in this house of mystery. What was it? And what the danger suggested by the final injunction of the girl to bolt the door of his bedroom? From whom? Ivanich? From the shock-headed youth in the kitchen who had stared at him so curiously? Or from others whom he had not seen? He gave up the problem and slowly removed his boots and tattered clothing, which he tossed with some disgust into a corner. The order of the room reproached him, and, tired as he was, he cleansed himself to be worthy of the immaculate linen, then blew out the light, and with a sigh of delight at the luxury of sheets, he crawled into bed and tried to relax. He had thought of this moment for weeks, and how he would sleep if he was ever again offered a bed. But now, strangely enough, his muscles twitched and his eyes remained open, staring into the obscurity. Tanya. That was a pretty name. Tatiana, probably. There was a fairy princess of that name who came to him suddenly from out of the mists of childhood. A princess with a filmy veil, a diadem upon her forehead, and a magic white wand which accomplished the impossible. She was pure, she was beautiful, and had happened long ago, before his rather variegated career across 2 continents. This new Tanya was a part of the night. A gracious, kindly shade with a ruddy diadem and a roguish smile, which set aside the symbols of her strange servitude. He smiled as he thought of her and closed his lids again, but they flew open as though actuated by hidden springs. He was aware of some movement in the house about him. The soft pad of footsteps in the corridor outside, which went along a few paces and then seemed to pause just at his door. Then a murmur as though of voices in a low tone. Once he fancied the knob of his door was tried by a stealthy hand. So sure was he of this that he got out of bed and, without striking a light, examined the bolt to reassure himself that the door was firmly fastened. Then he smiled to himself and went noiselessly back to bed. The soldier Roland was merely aware of a devouring curiosity, but presently the demands of his weary muscles vanquished even this, and he slept. He awoke suddenly, as he had often done in the dugouts at the warning of the sentry, and started upright in bed, listening. The softness of the sheets perplexed him, and it was a moment before he realized where he was. No sound but the murmur of insects outside the house and the sighing of a breeze. What had awakened him? Noiselessly he got up and tried the bolt of the door. It was fastened. Then he stole cautiously to the window and peered down into the garden. By the starlight he could dimly see the lawn, the path and the dais beyond where he had first seen Tanya. His eyes, trained like a cat's to the darkness during his weeks of night traveling, pierced slowly into every part of the obscurity beneath the trees. Something was moving there near the mound of earth, a dark figure with a cowled head and a robe. The figure moved forward slowly a few steps, peering from right to left, and then darted suddenly around to the other side of the dais, but always eager and watchful near the mound of earth. Roland seemed to identify the figure by its broad bent shoulders and shuffling walk as Kirillo Ivanich. As the American watched, he saw the Russian turn and walk slowly toward the house. Beneath Roland's window the Russian stopped with folded arms and looked upward. From beneath the black cowl the American seemed to feel the blazing eyes of Ivanitch upon his, but he knew that in his place of concealment he could not be seen, and so he did not move. And presently the man turned swiftly and went back to the mound of earth to resume his strange sentry duty. Philip Roland shrugged as he turned away from the window and went back to bed, grinning to himself. "Batty," he muttered to himself. "Completely batty." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Mystery. Philip Roland slept heavily until broad daylight, when the sun pierced his window and cast a cheerful golden lozenge upon the whitewashed wall above his iron bed. He stretched his arms luxuriously, and as the events of the previous night came to him, rose and looked out of the window. A clamor of birds among the gilded treetops, long violet shadows along the dewy garden, and there on a bench upon the mound of earth which had perplexed him last night, a solitary black figure, quiescent but watchful. It was not Ivanitch or Tanya, but one that he had not seen before, for the figure wore no cowl, and the head was clearly visible. So they had kept watch all night. The American laughed outright. The things that had seemed weird and even uncanny in the darkness were, by the broad light of day, little short of arrant nonsense. Medieval flummery such as this in the fair sunlight of the summer morning. It was amateurish, sophomoric, and hardly worthy of the psychos of the intellectual mystic in the Prince Albert coat. Tanya, too, a dealer in magic and spells? He smiled to himself as he turned from the window. He knew women. They had a talent for the dramatic, but he wouldn't acknowledge even to himself that he was disappointed in Tanya. He wanted to keep last night's vision of her as a thing apart. She was his goddess of liberty. Whatever her share in this mumbo-jumbo business, she herself was never to be tawdry. He was softly whistling Tipperary as he unbolted his door and peered out into the silent corridor. There, upon a chair beside his door, was the clothing that Tanya had promised him, a suit of dark clothes, not a Prince Albert, he was joyed to discover, underwear, a shirt, and blessings upon blessings, scissors and a razor. She had forgotten nothing. There is a delight in cleanliness that only the cleanly who have become filthy can ever really know. But this escaped prisoner found a secret pleasure in the fact that he was now to become Philip Roland, gentleman, a person once known on Broadway and Fifth Avenue for the taste of his sartorial embellishments. He bathed again, shaved and dressed in the clothing, which fitted him atrociously, and went down the stairs into the room through which he had passed last night. There was no one about, and the door into the kitchen was closed, though an appetizing odor of coffee pervaded the air. He glanced at the books upon the table, a few novels, Turgenev, Dostoevsky in French, some Russian newspapers, and a miscellaneous lot of German and French socialistic periodicals. Socialism, of course, the veneer that might cover a rougher grain beneath. But the most extraordinary object in the room, one which the visitor had not noticed last night, was a piece of ancient sculpture upon a pedestal in a corner of the room. A double-headed bust, one face young and beardless, with shut lips and a steadfast gaze, the other older, with wrinkled brows, a wild, anxious look in the eyes, and a mouth open as though in horror. Around the neck of the double head, a garland of what seemed to be oak leaves was carved into the stone, and upon the pedestal the inscription Rex Nemorensis. That the sculpture was of a great antiquity was indicated by its worn surfaces and discolorations. And Roland paused, studying it attentively, lost in speculation as to what, if any, connection this curious work of ancient art could have with the mystery of this house. Nemi. Ivanich had mentioned it last night. Rex Nemorensis, King of the Wood. But what was the symbolism of the two heads, the young man and the old? The young one eager and fearless, the other old, anxious and terrified. Nemi. Where had he come upon the name before? It seemed to echo to him out of the past. Nemi, a name out of a legend, written as though with fire against the darkness of a childish nightmare, and then extinguished. A name of something beautiful and something unhappy, something dreadful and something fascinating. The name of a blessing or of a curse. He shrugged at last, winked cheerfully at the hideous face on the pedestal, and gave the problem up. Then, turning, he sauntered toward a door which seemed to lead to the front of the garden. But before he reached it, a voice came from over his shoulder, and turning quickly, he saw the girl Tanya standing on the stairway, giving him good morning. Her black robes had been discarded, and she was dressed quite simply in a white morning frock, which accentuated the lines of the strong, slender figure and answered some of the questions that her sober garb had denied him. She was young, resilient, full of the joys of the awakened day, and wonderfully good to look at. The two of them stood for a moment staring at each other as though they had never seen each other before, Roland's eyes full of admiration, which he made no effort to conceal. It was Tanya who first spoke. "You are so different, Monsieur Roland, that I wasn't quite sure," she laughed, "if I hadn't known the clothes." "And you, mademoiselle?" He paused, seeking a word. "You are the morning." "Did you sleep well?" "Like the dead." "I was not disturbed." He smiled significantly, but she seemed not to notice, as she crossed to the door of the kitchen and ordered the coffee. And in a moment they were sitting at a table in an adjoining room, where the shock-headed man brought the urn from the kitchen and a tray upon which were eggs, butter, and petits pains. Roland studied the man carefully, and noted a sharp look from the fellow as their glances crossed. But in a mirror opposite him he saw the man pause as he went out, and turn and stare at him with so malevolent a look that the American recalled quite vividly his impressions of the night before. He was not wanted here. Whatever the affairs of this place, it was obvious that, to all except the girl Tanya, Roland was de trop. As he ate, he found his curiosity as to the strange actions of the men of Nemi gathering impetus. They were like a lot of Boche having a morning hate. However hospitable the girl, it was clear that they resented his presence, and from a window, even as he sat, he could see the ridiculous black figure of the third man mounting guard over the absurd tree at the other side of the garden. But Roland grinned and drank of his coffee, sure now that the eyes of Tanya Korasov had something on all those of a winter garden chorus rolled into two. But they weren't bold eyes like some others he had known. They appraised him frankly, but without the least timidity. She had given him her friendship last night, and until he went on his way he was her guest, to whom the hospitality of the house was open. "Monsieur Ivanich," she said after a moment, and with, as he fancied, a slight air of constraint, "begs that you will excuse him, as he will take his coffee upstairs." "Of course. I hope I haven't interfered." "It doesn't matter," she put in quickly. "Something happened which disturbed him. He is overworked and often distraught with nerves." "I'm sorry." "He is accustomed to being much alone," she added with an abstracted air. "I won't bother him much longer. I'll be off in a moment. But I regret to go without knowing something more of you, mademoiselle. Your kindness, in spite of the hostility of Monsieur Ivanich. Your fear for my safety last night." I merely thought that if you bolted your door, you would be able to pass a night of rest." Her manner was not altogether convincing. He looked at her soberly and went on softly. "I'm not a meddler by nature, mademoiselle," he continued, "but I do confess to a devouring curiosity. The organization to which you belong is secret. I can perhaps guess some of its purposes, but the mystery which I have met on every hand, I can tell you nothing," she said, her eyes averted. "Not even that what you do is not distasteful to you?" She lowered her voice a note. "I'm not unhappy," she said slowly. "Nor contented. There is a danger in the air, a nameless danger which, if it does not threaten you, menaces those about you." "Danger!" she said quickly. "What does that matter to me? When when all Europe is bleeding to death, I fear nothing." "Not even an escaping slave?" The words, uttered quickly, almost at random, had a most startling effect upon her. She drew back quickly from the table and then leaned forward, whispering. "Sh! You knew?" she asked. "You came here?" She paused and was silent again. Was it not that phrase which so profoundly affected Monsieur Ivanich? he asked. She made no reply. He rose from the table and straightened. "You wish me to go, mademoiselle?" he asked. She hesitated a moment, and then with a gasp, "Yes, you must go at once." He shrugged, smiled, and turned away. It was too bad. "Of course I have no right to question you, but I should like to put myself at your command for any service." "You can do nothing. Only go, monsieur." He looked at her eagerly. There was a change in her manner. She too had at last turned against him. It seemed that she had grown a shade paler, and he saw her eyes staring in a startled way as at some object behind him. Instinctively he turned. The door into the kitchen was partly open, and half through the aperture, distorted with some strange agony, was the face of Kirillo Ivanich. In the fleeting moment before the Russian emerged, it seemed to Roland that this was the exact expression on the face of the anguished half of the double bust in the adjoining room, the face of the older man in terror and fury. But he had to admit that in the flesh and blood it was far more convincing. Ivanich now thrust the door open with a bang and stood, his arms, long like an ape's, hanging to the knees of his trouser legs, at which the bony fingers plucked unpleasantly. He did not speak to Roland, though his gaze never left his face. but he muttered something hoarsely in Russian to Tanya, an angry phrase, the tone of which sent the hot blood flying to fill Roland's temples. He did not know what she replied, but her voice was pitched low and had a note of contrition that still further inflamed him. Last night he had thought Ivanich merely an eccentric zealot, unnerved by too much work. Now he seemed surely mad, a maniac, not far from the verge of violence. The Russian took a pace forward toward the American, who stood his ground, conscious of a rising anger at the inhospitality and a growing desire to see the thing through, whatever happened. But a glance at Tanya found her gaze fixed on him with a look so earnestly appealing that he suppressed the hot words that had risen to his tongue. "I am sorry, Monsieur Ivanich," he said coolly, taking refuge in the formal French phrase, "to have so far strained the hospitality of Nemi." "Go, then," growled the Russian, pointing toward the door. The voice was brutal, harsh, inhuman, and challenged all that was intemperate in Roland, aroused again the reckless venturing spirit that had sent him forth to deal with the primitive forces of evil. He leaned forward toward the distorted face, his arms akimbo, and stared the Russian in the eyes. And then a strange thing happened. The blaze in the Russian's eyes was suddenly extinguished. It was as though a film had passed over them, leaving them pale, like a burnt-out cinder. His jaw fell, too. His arms flapped aimlessly a moment and then fell to his sides as he retreated through the open door into the kitchen. "Go!" he whispered querulously, as though his voice, too, had been burnt out. "Go!" As the man disappeared, Roland relaxed and turned toward Tanya with a shrug. "A madman," he muttered. "You can't stay here, Mademoiselle Korasoff." "It's nothing," she said breathlessly. "When you are gone, he will recover. You must go now, monsieur. Hurry, or harm will come." "To you?" eagerly. "To you, monsieur." "I'm not frightened," he said with a grin. "I know, but you must go at once. Here, this way. The gate is in the garden wall." And she opened the door and stood aside to let him pass. He took up the cap she had provided for him and paused a moment to offer her his hand. "I thank you again, mademoiselle." She touched his fingers lightly, but he caught her own and held them a moment. "Goodbye," he said gently. "God bless and preserve you, Monsieur Roland," she whispered. He stepped out into the garden, the girl just behind him, indicating the gate in the wall about 50 yards distant, the only exit from the enclosure. But as he emerged from the shadow of the house and turned up the path toward the gate, a loud whistle sounded from the direction of the dais, where the monkish figure that had been on guard rose suddenly, like a raven interrupted at a meal, flapping its wings and screaming discordantly. To his left, in the wall of the house, doors flew open noisily and men emerged. Ivanich, the shock-headed man, and another. They did not come toward Roland, but moved abreast of him as he went up the garden path, silent, watchful, keeping pace with him, like men in open order, advancing in skirmish line. Ivanich, nearest him, not more than 3 paces distant. Ivanich the fantastic. Ivanich the impossible. Roland eyed him curiously. His face was moist with perspiration, and the wisp of black hair was glued to his white forehead. His eyes no longer blazed, for they were invisible under the dark thatch of his bent brows. But his figure and gait gave every token of the strange terror that had suddenly swept over him in the middle of their conversation last night.
Roland grinned at him cheerfully. They dreaded him, these four men, dreaded and feared him. But Ivanitch dreaded and feared him most. The situation was comic. Roland increased his pace. They increased theirs. He paused. They stopped. It was like a game. Roland went on again. He was the guide, it seemed, of this strange, awkward squad. But as he neared the turn in the path which led to the gate, the shock-headed man went forward in the direction of the dais, while Ivanitch came a pace closer, bent forward, his long arms hanging, still watching him eagerly. The creature was menacing. The distance to the gate was now short. But the idea of turning his back to this madman, who might spring upon him from behind, was most unpleasant. So Roland stopped and faced him, catching a glimpse of Tanya Korasov, who had followed them and stood nearby, listening and watching, aware of the hazardous moment. "It is a pleasant morning, Monsieur Ivanitch," said Roland coolly.
"The gate is yonder,"
croaked the Russian.
"Go."
"All in good time," said Roland. "But I've something to say first." The Russian's thin lips worked, but he said nothing, though his fingers twitched against his legs. "I thank you for your hospitality, such as it is. But you don't like me, monsieur." "Our sentiments are reciprocal. Your attitude even now is most unpleasant, not to say offensive. Were it not for mademoiselle, I should have lost my temper long ago."
"Go! Go!"
cried the Russian chokingly. He seemed trembling on the brink of some nervous paroxysm. "When I'm ready. In the meanwhile, listen."
"What have I to do with you?"
"You know best about that," said Roland coolly, aware of a new desire to probe the mystery if he could. The eyes of Ivanitch, paling as though they could not endure the sunlight, stared wildly as he raised his haggard face.
"You have known from the beginning?"
muttered Ivanitch. "Yes, yes," cried Roland eagerly. "It is not true, Kirillo Ivanitch," he heard the girl Tanya crying. "He knew nothing. He knows nothing now." And then appealingly to Roland, "Oh, go, monsieur. Please go at once." But Ivanitch was oblivious.
"Destiny!"
he muttered wildly.
"The Visconti!"
Roland started back. "Visconti," he repeated. It was the family name of his own mother. Ivanitch wagged his great head from side to side, his fists clasping and unclasping in the throes of some mad indecision. And then he came for Roland, head down, his long arms groping. The American heard the girl's scream and the shouts of the other men as he sprang aside to elude the rush. But Ivanitch was quick, and in a moment they were locked in struggle. Roland was tall, wiry and agile, but privation had sapped some of his strength, and the grip of the Russian around his body bore him backward up the lawn, along the wall, where they both tripped over a projecting root and fell to the ground, Ivanitch uppermost. The fall stunned Roland, but he managed to get a hand on the Russian's throat and clutched with the strength of desperation. A madman! Once in a German trench he had fought with such another. But there were weapons there, and fortune had favored him. But his fingers seemed to meet in the throat of the fanatic, and the grip around his own body relaxed as with an effort he threw the man away from him and rolled clear. As he sprang to his feet he was aware of the other men attacking him. There was a sound of shots and the familiar acrid smell of powder, but he felt no pain, and as the shock-headed fellow came at him, a short arm blow under the chin sent him reeling against a tree, where he crumpled and fell.
As he turned again to meet Ivanitch, he had a vision of Tanya with arm upraised, and heard her clear voice above the tumult.
"Picard! Isad! Stop! I command you!"
And then,
"Kirillo! Monsieur Roland! It is madness!"
Madness it was, but none of Phil Roland's choosing. They had fought to a point just below the mound of earth on which he had first seen Tanya by the tree, and it was at the foot of the steps that Ivanitch again rushed at him. Roland's blow staggered him, but he came on furiously, and as the arm of the Russian went high over his head, the American caught the glint of sunlight on a weapon and threw up his arm, catching the force of the blow upon his elbow. But he felt a stinging pain in his shoulder and clutched the man's arm as he raised it to strike again. Up the slope of the mound they struggled, breathlessly intent, the one to murder, the other to save himself. Roland fought coolly now, grimly, smiling as a soldier of the Legion must, aware that only as long as the threatening right arm of the Russian was pinioned was he safe from the treacherous knife. But it was right arm against left, and too close to strike. Roland avoided the stone bench toward which the Russian had forced him, and twisting suddenly freed his right arm and struck the Russian a fearful blow in the body. He felt the arm of Ivanitch relax, and in a second had torn the weapon from his clasp and sent it flying into the bushes. Ivanitch came at him again, and again Roland struck, each time with greater precision. Ivanitch rushed him against the tree, a branch of which was torn off in Roland's hand. Illustration: the American caught the glint of sunlight on a weapon. He heard a cry behind him and a whimper as of an animal in pain from Ivanitch.
"The bough!" he cried. "The bough!"
But as he came on again, Roland stepped aside and hit him as he passed. The Russian staggered sideways, his head striking the stone bench, rolled down the slope of the mound and lay still. The American slowly straightened and glanced around him. A sudden silence had fallen. At the foot of the steps stood Tanya Korasoff, a revolver in her hand, and beside her the scarecrow in black, and the two others, inert, horrified. Roland, breathing hard from his exertions, stared stupidly at the misshapen bundle of clothing at the foot of the slope, and then down at the branch of the tree which he still held in his hand.
"The bough!"
the shock-headed man muttered in an awed whisper.
"The golden bough!"
Roland raised the branch of the tree, looked at it curiously, and then dropped it to the ground. "You saw?" he gasped to the motionless group below. "You saw? He attacked me. It was self-defense. It was not my fault." Tanya Korasoff had rushed to the sprawling figure in the Prince Albert coat, lifted its head, and then recoiled in horror, her face hidden in her hands. "You saw?" Roland repeated as he came toward them. "All of you. It was self-defense." They drew back as he came down the steps, but made no effort to molest him.
"The golden bough,"
the shock-headed man said again, and another,
"It is broken."
It was no time for such gibberish. Roland turned them a scornful shoulder and went over to the girl beside the motionless black figure. To the question in his eyes, the girl's eyes replied.
"He is dead,"
she whispered, and then looked up at Roland, gaze wide and lips parted.
"And you?"
If there was horror, there was no reproach in her tone. Her attitude was more one of consternation and surprise.
"And you, Monsieur Roland?"
she whispered in an awed tone.
"It is you who are—"
And then she stopped, as though frozen suddenly into immobility and silence. Chapter 4 of The Golden Bough by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Tanya. And while he stood still, bewildered by the odd tone and startled air of the girl, he saw that the three men had come forward and had taken position in a group beside him. He glanced at them at once upon the defensive, but was quickly reassured by their passive appearance and attitude, for they stood with heads bowed like mourners at the grave of a departed friend. With this difference, that their eyes, oblivious of the figure upon the turf, were turned upon Roland, gazing expectantly, in an awe like Tanya's but unlike hers, intimidated, respectful, and obedient. Roland felt like laughing in their faces, but the figure in the Prince Albert coat upon the ground reminded him that the mystery behind this fantastic tragedy was at least worthy of consideration. Whatever the aims of this strange company, and however tawdry the means by which they accomplished them, the fact remained that here at his feet lay Kirillo Ivanitch, dead because of his convictions. With increasing bewilderment he stared at Tanya and again at the others. "What do you mean, mademoiselle?" he asked. "I don't understand." Her reply mystified him further. "The Visconti," she stammered. "You know the name?" "Visconti, yes. It was the name of my Italian mother." At this reply Tanya started to her feet, and behind him he heard the murmur of excitement. "Speak, mademoiselle," said Roland. "What's this mystery?" Tanya put her fingers to her brows a moment. "Something very strange has happened, Monsieur Roland," she said with difficulty. "Something long predicted. Promises written in the legends of Nemi for hundreds of years, and it is you, monsieur, who have fulfilled them." "I?" he asked in surprise. "How?" "That the Visconti should again become the heads of our order." "What order?" "The order of the priesthood of Nemi." "Priesthood? I?" Roland grinned unsympathetically at the solemn faces which were mocking at his common sense. His appreciation of the ridiculous, which from the first had held in good-humored contempt the signs of medieval flummery. "You, monsieur," said the man in the cowl, whom they called Issad. "There is no doubt it is written." "I've not written it," said Roland contemptuously.
"The priest of Nemi. You have broken the Golden Bough,"
put in the shock-headed man. "Oh, I see. I broke your silly tree. I'm sorry."
"Sorry?"
whispered Issad, pointing to the dead man.
"It is he who should be sorry."
"I've no doubt he is," muttered Roland. "But he brought this on himself." "That is true," said the third man eagerly, the one Tanya had called Picard.
"We are all witnesses to it."
Roland frowned at the man. "Then will you tell me what the devil you meant by shooting a pistol at me?" cried Roland angrily. Picard hung his head.
"It was he who was the priest of Nemi while he lived. Our oath, our allegiance."
"Ah, I see," put in Roland. "And now the water is on the other shoulder." He shrugged, and as he did so was aware of a sharp pain where the knife of Ivanitch had struck him, and from the fingers of his left hand he saw that blood was dripping. Tanya, who had stood silent during this conversation, came forward, touching his arm. "Monsieur is wounded," she said gently. "You must come." Roland impersonally examined the blood at his fingertips. "If you wish to call the gendarmes," he began coolly.
"Gendarmes?"
broke out Picard excitedly.
"Non, monsieur.
There must be no police here. Nemi settles its own affairs." Roland glanced at the fellow. He was not hostile, but desperately in earnest, and the faces of the two other men reflected his seriousness. Tanya Korosov was silent, but into her face had come new lines of decision. "If you will go into the house, monsieur," she said quietly, "I will bind your wound and perhaps give you a reason why the police should not be called to Nemi." Her suggestion reminded him that the wounded shoulder was now tingling unpleasantly, and so, with a glance at the others, who seemed eagerly to assent to his departure, Roland nodded and followed the girl toward the house. A while ago the strange actions of this fantastic household had keenly amused him, for Roland was a product of an unimaginative age, a nomad of the cities, bent upon a great errand which had nothing to do with priesthoods. But now the startling sequence of events, culminating in the mention of his mother's name and the death of Ivanich, had made him aware that the arm of coincidence was long, or that destiny was playing a hand with so sure an intention that he, Phil Roland, for all his materialism, must accept the facts and what came of them. Destiny! Perhaps. For a year Roland had believed it his destiny to be killed in battle, instead of which he had lived the life of a dog in a prison camp and escaped into freedom. But a priest of a secret order, ordained 27 years ago, when in the smug security of the orderly Roland House in West 59th Street he had been born. The thing was unthinkable. But there before him, treading soberly, her slender figure clad in a modish frock, which must have come from the Rue de la Paix, was Tanya. And there behind him, in the arms of Picard, Isade, and the shock-headed man, was the dead Ivanich, in token that the prediction of the legends of Nemi had been fulfilled. He followed the girl into the house and upstairs, where she helped him remove his coat and shirt and bathed and anointed the slight cut in his shoulder. If in his mind he was uncertain as to the judgment of the 20th century upon his extraordinary adventure, he was very sure that Tanya Korosov, at least, was very real, her fingers very soft, her touch brave, and her expressions of solicitude very genuine. And it was sufficient for Roland to believe that an intelligence such as that which burned behind her fine level brows could not be guilty of the worship of false gods. Intelligent, sane, and feminine to her fingertips. The sanity of Tanya, more even than the madness of Ivanich, gave credence to the story that she was to tell him. "Thanks, mademoiselle," he said gently, when she had finished. "You are very good to one who has brought so much trouble and distress upon you." She looked up at him quickly and then away, while into her eyes came a rapt expression, as that of one who sees a vision. "Distress," she said listlessly, and then slowly, "No, it is not that. Monsieur Ivanich was nothing to me. But death, such a death, can be nothing less than horrible." Her lip trembled, she shuddered a little, and he saw that a reaction had set in. She rose to hide her weakness and walked the length of the room. "Forgive me. I should have gone last night." "No, no," she said hysterically. "You can bear no blame, nor I. He attacked you yonder. You had to defend yourself." She broke off, clasping her hands and turning away from him. "How could I have known that you were... that you... I thought it mere timidity, nervousness on his part, fear born of the danger that had so long hung over him. I knew the legend of Nemi. But monsieur..." She threw out her arms wildly. I am no dreamer of dreams, no mystic, no fanatic. I have never believed that such strange things could come to pass. But Kirillo Ivanich had a vision. You were death. You were stalking him there, And he knew." She laughed hysterically and turned away from him again. "You see, monsieur, I am not quite myself." Roland glanced at her steadily a moment and then quickly went to the cupboard where last night she had found the jug of chartreuse, and pouring her out a glass, carried it to where she stood struggling with herself at the window. "Drink," he said sternly. "It will quiet you." She glanced at the glass, then at him, and obeyed. "Do not speak now," he urged quietly. "Wait until you feel better." "No, I am well again. I must speak at once. I must tell you all. It is your right to know." She sank resolutely into the chair before him and leaned forward, her hands clasped over her knees, her gaze fixed on the empty hearth. "Monsieur Ivanich was my compatriot, Monsieur Roland. That is all. I was sent here to him 3 years ago to help in the great cause to which I have given my life." "Your parents, mademoiselle," broke in Roland eagerly. She moved a hand as though to eliminate all things that pertained to herself. "It does not matter what I am, so long as you know that I am a Russian, sworn to bring Russia's freedom from those who seek to work her ruin."
"And Ivanich?"
"A Russian born, an exile, a zealot, a possible tool in the hands of those more dangerous than he." "Mademoiselle, there are others." "Listen, monsieur. I must begin at the beginning or you will not understand what my task has been and what, God willing, you will help me to do."
"I?"
"You, monsieur."
Roland was silent, looking at her, sure now of a deeper import to her meaning.
"If there is anything I can do to help Russia, to help France here, you may count upon me," he said quietly. He might have added, to help Tanya Korosov, but something warned him that a hidden fire within her had burst into a flame which burned out all lesser ones. Her fine eyes regarded him steadily in a moment of intense appraisal, and then she went on. "The origin of the priesthood of Nemi, monsieur," she said, "is lost in the mazes of antiquity. According to one story, the priesthood began with the worship of Diana at Nemi, near Rome, and was instituted by Orestes, who fled to Italy. Within the sanctuary at Nemi there grew a certain tree, of which no branch might be broken. Only a runaway slave was allowed to break off, if he could, one of its boughs."
"A runaway slave," he smiled. "Then I?"
She nodded. "You may think it fantastic, but that was what Monsieur Ivanich feared when he learned last night what you were. And I—"
She stopped again.
"I could not believe that such things were possible."
"They aren't," said Roland quietly. His quiet voice steadied her.
"It is a strange tale," she said with a slow smile, "but you must hear it all. Only a runaway slave who succeeded in reaching the golden bough and broke it was entitled to challenge the priest in single combat. If he killed him, he reigned in the place of the priest, king of the wood."
"Rex Nemorensis," muttered Roland.
"You've heard?"
"I read it there," pointing to the pedestal. And as he looked, the meaning of the double bust came to him, the anguished face of the older man and the frowning face of the youth who was to take his place. "He was afraid of me," he said. "I understand."
"The legend tells that the golden bough," she went on quickly, "was that which at the Sibyl's bidding Aeneas plucked before he visited the world of the dead. The flight of the slave was the flight of Orestes. His combat with the priest, a relic of the human sacrifices once offered to the Tauric Diana, a rule of succession by the sword which was observed down to imperial times."
"A ghastly succession. And Ivanich?"
he questioned. She frowned and bent forward, her chin cupped in a hand. "No one knows of his succession, or no one will tell. It was said that when he returned from Siberia, he killed the man who had sent him there." "A pretty business," said Roland, rising. "But I did not kill Kirillo Ivanitch," he protested. "It was he himself who——" He paused and stared at Tanya thoughtfully. "You cannot deny that if he had not attacked you, he would be here, alive, now." "That is true, perhaps. But murder? Assassination?" He stopped and smiled grimly. "Mademoiselle Korasoff, I'm a soldier and have seen bloodshed in a righteous cause. I kill a strange German in a trench because there is not room for us both, and because I am trained to kill as a duty I owe to France. But this," he waved his hand toward the garden, "this is a brawl. A man attacks me. I defend myself. I strike him with my fists when I might have plunged his own knife into his heart. You saw me. I threw his knife away and fought as we do in my own country, with my own hands. If he falls and strikes his head upon a stone——" He broke off with a shrug. "Whatever your rights, and I bear witness to them, nevertheless, monsieur, justified as you are in our eyes and your own conscience, it was you who killed Kirillo Ivanitch." He stared at her for a moment. Her brows were drawn, but her eyes peered beyond him, as though only herself saw with a true vision. No fanatic, no dreamer? Then what was behind her thoughts, the ones she had not uttered? "The man is dead," he mumbled. "If I am guilty of his death, I want a court, a judge. I will abide by the law." But Tanya was slowly shaking her head. "There shall be no court, no judges but those of Nemi. We saw, we know. There shall be no inquiry. Nemi shall bury its own dead. And you, monsieur?" "And I?" he asked as she paused. "You, Monsieur Roland, shall be the head of the Order of Nemi." "But mademoiselle, you don't understand. I am a part of the armies of Republican France, a part of the great machinery, a small part, lost, but now restored to go on with the great task a free world has set itself to do." "A great task!" The girl had risen now and caught him by the arm with a grasp that seemed to try to burn its meaning into his very bones. And her voice, sunk to a whisper, came to his ears with tragic clearness. "There's a greater task for you here, monsieur. A task that will take greater courage than facing the grenades of the trenches. A task that will take more than courage. A task only for one of skill, intelligence, and great daring. Is it danger that you seek? You will find it here. A danger that will lurk with you always. An insidious threat that will be most dangerous when least anticipated. There are others, Monsieur Roland, who may be taught to shoot from the trenches. But there is another destiny for you, a great destiny. To do for the world what 500,000 of armed men have it not within their power to do. It is here, that destiny, here at Nemi, and the weapons shall be forged in your brain, monsieur. Subtle weapons, keen ones, subtler and keener than those of the enemies who will be all about you. Your enemies, but more important than that, the enemies of France, or Russia, England, and all the free peoples of the earth." She had seemed inspired, and her eager eyes raised to his burned with a gorgeous fire. "Germany," he whispered. "Here?" "Here, everywhere. They plot, they plan, they seek control, to put men in high places where the cause of Junkerism may be served." "But they cannot." "I have not told you all. Listen." She released his arm and said, "You have misjudged us here. To your Western eyes, we're mere actors in a morbid comedy of our own choosing. Masqueraders, or fanatics, pursuing our own foolish ritual in a sort of mild frenzy of self-absorption. But Nemi means something more than that. It reaches back beyond ancient Rome, comes down through the ages, through Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, through France, Germany, and Russia. A secret society, the oldest in the history of the world, and the most powerful, with tentacles reaching into the politics of Freemasonry, of socialism, of nihilism, of maximalism. The Society of Nemi, an international society, with leaders in every party, a hidden giant with 100 groping arms which only need a brain to actuate them all to one purpose." She paused a moment, her hand at her heart while she caught her breath. "And that purpose, Monsieur Roland, the saving of the world from autocracy," she said impressively. He did not dare smile at her, for her revelations were astounding, and in spite of himself all that was venturesome in his spirit had caught of her fire. The rapidity of her utterance and the nature of her disclosures for a moment struck him dumb. How much of this story that she told him was true, and how much born in the brain of the dead Ivanich? A secret society with ramifications throughout Europe. A power which might pass into the hands of the enemies of France. Roland was not dull, and clear thinking was slowly driving away the mists of illusion, leaving before him the plain facts of his extraordinary situation. "I am no believer in mysticism, Mademoiselle Korasoff," he said at last, smiling. "Nor in a destiny written before I was born. What you tell of the history of Nemi is interesting. What you say of the Visconti, very strange, startlingly so. But I am the product of an age of materialism. This drama was born and developed in the brain of a dreamer and zealot. Don't you see? A strange coincidence unhinged him. He attacked me as he might have attacked any other escaping prisoner." "But all escaping prisoners are not of the Visconti," she said. He shrugged and smiled. "I still think you more than half believe in all this." He hesitated a moment, and then with cool distinctness, "This folderol." She glanced up quickly and rose. "Listen, monsieur," she said soberly. "You may believe what you please of the legends of Nemi, but you cannot deny the material facts as to its influence. There are documents here which will prove to you that what I say is true. Members of the Order of Nemi are high in the councils of the great. Its power is limitless for evil or for good in the world. Whether you believe in it or not, you are its leader, in accordance with its strange laws of succession, which have come down through the ages, and you are recognized as such by those others yonder, and will be recognized by others who will come, its high priest." Roland's gesture of impatience made her pause. "I'm no priest," he laughed. "Call yourself what you like, then," she cried. "It does not matter. But think, monsieur, of what I am telling you. An opportunity, power, international leadership, and a goal, the freedom of Europe. Oh, is not that a career worthy of the ambition of any man on the earth? And you quibble at the sound of a name." Her tone was almost contemptuous. She had walked to the window and stood there trembling. He paused a moment and then walked over to her. "I haven't denied you, mademoiselle. I've merely refused to believe in the supernatural. Call my presence here a coincidence. The death of Kirillo Ivanich by its true name, an act of involuntary manslaughter, and I will do whatever you like." if I can serve France better here than on the battle line." She flashed around on him and clasped his hand.
"You mean it?"
"I do. If I can help you here, I will act whatever part you please."
"At once? There is no time to lose."
"I shall obey you."
"No, it is I who must obey you. And they, Picard, Isard, Stepan, Margot. But more than these, Shestov, Madame Rochal, Signorina Kolodna, and Liedermann."
"Who are these?"
"Members of the order, counselors who will come to you to give advice and to take it."
He smiled. "Ah, I see. They are coming here soon?" She nodded.
"A council has been called. The members may reach here today. You will meet them?"
"Have I not told you that I will do what I can? But I must know their nationalities, their purposes."
"Oh, I shall tell you all that, and warn you. Remember, monsieur, you are the leader of Nemi."
"And as such," he grinned, "subject to sacrifice upon the altar of your precious priesthood." She touched the back of his hand lightly with her fingers.
"Shush, monsieur. It is no laughing matter. And there are those I must warn you against."
Her eyes stared widely past him from under tangled brows.
"Two whom you must fear. Of finesse, craft and intelligence, a woman without a conscience, and a man without a soul."
"Ah, you interest me. A woman. Their names." Before Tanya Korasov could reply, there was a knock upon the door, which was pushed quickly open, and the shock-headed man entered.
"What is it, Stepan?"
asked the girl.
"Monsieur Krodkina has just come in at the gate, mademoiselle," he said in French.
Roland saw the girl start and felt her fingers close upon his arm.
"Ah, Stepan," she said quietly, "tell him to come here, and bring Isard and Picard."
And when Stepan had gone,
"It is one of those whom I have spoken, Monsieur Roland," she stammered. "Be upon your guard, monsieur, and keep this paper, committing to memory the names and figures upon it."
Roland opened the slip of paper curiously, and it bore this inscription: Droite 12, Gauche 23, Droite 7. End of chapter 4.